We will be reading our scripture reading, which of course is our sermon text this morning for 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5, we'll be reading verses 1 through 16. 1 Timothy 5, 1 through 16. Do not sharply rebuke an older man, but rather appeal to him as a father, to the younger men as brothers, the older women as mothers, and the younger women as sisters in all purity. Honor widows who are widows indeed. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. Now she who is a widow indeed and who has been left alone has fixed her hope on God and continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. But she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. Prescribe these things as well so that they may be above reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. The widow is to be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, and if she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted those in distress, and if she has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to put younger women on the list, for when they feel sensual desires and disregard for Christ, they want to get married, thus incurring condemnation because they have set aside their previous pledge. At the same time, they also learn to be idle, and they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. Therefore, I want younger widows to get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no occasion for reproach, for some have already turned aside to follow Satan. If any woman who is a believer has dependent widows, she must assist them, and the church must not be burdened, so that it may assist those who are widows indeed.
Amen. Thank you, Tim. We are there in 1 Timothy 5. If you've, again, new or visiting with us, we've been working through this book for the last few months, and today we have just 2 chapters left, but we come to this text, 1 Timothy chapter 5. I encourage you to follow along as we look here at verses 1 through 16. There's a famous quote that says, "You can tell the character of a man by how he treats those who can do nothing for him." So how does the CEO treat the intern? How does the intern treat the homeless guy? It's tempting sometimes, isn't it, to do unto others because of what they can do unto you? And yet, a truly virtuous man will treat everyone, even the powerless and the penniless, with dignity and with care. If I may, I think that quote can be tweaked just a bit in light of our passage. I think the Apostle Paul would also remind us that you can tell the character of a church by how it treats those that can do nothing for them. I think this is what James was also saying in that famous passage in James 1. You know it, you could probably quote it with me, that what pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God is to visit orphans and widows in their distress. Orphans have no money to pay you back. Widows have no power to share with you or to do you favors. And so to treat those individuals with care, the apostle says that is pure faith. That is true faith. That is the character of Christian faith. And I think Paul picks up on that idea here that James mentioned. And he zeroes in on one of those 2 groups and gives us 16 verses of instruction about how to care for widows. Now, why does Paul do this? Well, if you've been tracking in our study of 1 Timothy, there's a phrase that we saw back in chapter 3 that I think is the key to unlock most of the book. He describes the church as, quote, the household of God. In other words, the church is not just like a family, it is God's family. And we should see those around us with that same perspective. And so Paul would urge us and to remember that in times of need, family helps family. And yet, for some, they may have no family except those who are in the church. And the church may, in fact, be their family. Paul zeroes in on the widows and those who are in need and how we can care for them. Now, this is one of those passages we aren't very familiar with and we don't maybe talk about often because I'm not sure we know in our world what to do with this passage. In fact, just a real quick little Bible study tip. You may know this, but if not, anytime you study the Bible, just recognize there is always a gap between the world that we live in and the world that they lived in. And as the British say, you have to mind the gap. You got to know that distance. So there are certain things that they were dealing with historically, contextually, politically, economically. It's not quite us, and so you sometimes have to step back and say, now, what's the underlying principle? What's the lesson here for us? This is one of those passages. So, for instance, think about when Peter says, honor the king. We could go, oh, well, we don't have a king, and just push that aside. But no, we recognized in their context they had a king, and so what do we learn from that? This passage is one I think similar to that. To really appreciate this text, you have to imagine living in a society completely unlike the one we are in. A world in which there was no safety net for the poor. No health insurance, no life insurance, no Medicare, no Social Security, no 401ks, no government programs. The only safety net that you had was your family. And if you had no family, where would you turn? Where would you go? The Apostle Paul says that if they are Christians, they should be able to turn to the church because the church is their family. And that the widows in particular, the church may be their only family. And we should see and care for them accordingly. We may not have a high population we have a number of widows, but that particularly meet this criteria. But I think we can apply this in other ways as we think about the poor, as we think about single mothers, as we think about those that might come across our path that have other needs. I think Paul would urge us to consider how we care for those who, as I said, maybe can do nothing for us. So Paul lays down 3 instructions here that challenge us on these things. The first is a general instruction, and then he gets to particulars in this text. Let's follow along. The first instruction we see in verses 1 and 2, Paul tells us to treat one another as family. To treat one another as family. Notice what he says. Do not sharply rebuke an older man, verse 1, but rather appeal to him as a father, to the younger men as brothers, the older women as mothers, and the younger women as sisters in all purity. Now, originally, when Timothy got this letter, there wasn't a giant 5 at the beginning of that section. There was no chapter divisions. So Paul is continuing the thought we saw last week where Paul is telling Timothy how to be a pastor. And the duties of a pastor we started last week include what? Things like preaching and praying, but also people. And people come in all shapes and sizes. They come in all ages and in both genders. And so Paul says, if you're going to address and deal with people, then Timothy, you got to know how to shift gears and how to deal with different kinds of people in different types of ways. But if you note it, there's a common thread in the way that he's to deal with them. It made me think of that old 70s TV show. Remember the title? Some of you are old enough. All in the Family. That's what he says here. When you relate to each other, everybody is either a father, a brother, a mother, or a sister. And you should treat each other with those family relationships and bonds. Notice the first one, verse 1, do not sharply rebuke an older man. Now, we learned last week in chapter 4, Timothy was a young man. We don't know how young, but most of the men in the men's ministry were probably older than him. And yet, there's going to come a point as the pastor, he's going to have to confront some of them to deal with sin issues. And he might be a little intimidated or feel like he's got to prove himself and sort of, hike up his pants and prove the fact that he's the pastor. And Paul says to Timothy, be careful. Your job is to be a pastor, not a bully. If you have to confront an older man, he says, don't give him a tongue lashing. Don't text him with a bunch of exclamation points. He says, instead, you ought to what? Appeal to him as you would a father. How would you approach your own dad in that case? Now, I don't think I have ever had to rebuke my dad. He can answer us later. I don't know. I don't think I've ever done that. But I have had times when I've had to show him something or teach him something he didn't know. And it's kind of awkward, right? It's like, things like how a smartphone works. I'm like, okay, Dad, no, push that. No, don't push that. No, swipe. Dad, give me the phone. It's like, right? There's a sense in which you're trying to teach, and it's loving, but it's, you got to be patient, right? How do you approach your father, right? You don't just walk away, right? It requires a different approach and a mindset. He says the older men, approach them like you would your own dad, especially if they need to be confronted or dealt with. Then he moves on from older to younger, notice verse 1, and treat the younger men as brothers. Well, how do brothers treat each other? It depends on what family you're in, right? We have 5 boys, and I can't tell sometimes if they're having a good time or murdering each other in the other room because they're that way. But if you eavesdrop, maybe even over Thanksgiving, you heard cousins get together, kind of the same age. If you eavesdrop on a bunch of boys, what do you hear? You'll often hear phrases like, come on, I dare you. Or phrases like, I'd knock it off. Right? Brothers are often bold with each other. They hold each other accountable. They kind of get in each other's face. They challenge each other. That's what he says here. To the men your age or younger than you, don't feel bad about kind of leaning in a little bit. You are their brother, so confront them, help them like a brother in the Lord. Then verse 2, he says, the older women as mothers. Most people have a soft spot for their mother, and even as time goes by, that spot usually gets softer and softer in many cases. He says here, you should treat every church mother as if she's your own mother. Right? How would you approach your own mom? With deference and humility and love and care and all of those things, right, that are nuanced and all that. He says you should treat the older women in that same way. And then finally in verse 2 he says, and the younger women as sisters in all purity. Brother-sister relationships are unique. We have 5 boys and 1 girl. And, I'm not positive, you can ask them this, but I suspect most of my boys, if they had to, they would protect their sister. They would defend their sister. They might even get in a fight, to help their sister, but they would never be caught kissing their sister on the lips. And she would not want it, trust me, at all. Well, why? Because there's a line there, right? Brother-sister relationship, it's a tight bond, but there's also a line. That's what Paul says. Timothy, treat the younger women like their sisters. And notice the phrase, in all purity. He means sexual purity. There's a reason that you hear of so many pastors that have affairs with women in their church. If a man isn't careful, pastoral warmth can turn flirtatious real quick. When you're dealing with people's vulnerable hearts and care and affection and encouragement and all of those things, and you have this mutual love in Christ, it's very careful that those lines can be crossed. And so Paul tells Timothy, you need to draw a line. Treat them like sisters with a degree of concern and love, but not crossing that line. So what's Paul's point in these first 2 verses? I think his point's pretty simple. In fact, let me show it to you. Here's what I want you to do for a second. I want you to look to your left and right at the people around you. Stop looking at me. Some of you are looking at me. Look at the people left and right. Okay, good, very good, excellent, all right, good. So here's Paul's point. If the people that you just looked at sitting around you, if you think of them as a crowd and not a family, something's wrong. If they're just strangers, Like, oh yeah, I see those people. Something's amiss. Paul says instead you should see the connection to others with a familial interest. That Sunday morning worship is not just an event or a show. It is a family gathering, but we gather to worship the Lord. Here at Forest, we were very blessed to have people of all ages. I don't know if you noticed earlier in the praise team, I was noticing we had teenagers up to, I won't guess the ages of the others, but we had people from all ages leading the singing. We have newborns to 90s in our church, which means what? We all have the opportunity to put this into practice. Chances are there's somebody older than you, somebody younger than you, sitting in this room. So the question is, how do you see them? Do you only see the people in your circle? Like just your small group? Just your Sunday school class? Just the few, guys your age or young ladies your age and just sort of stick to them? Or do you make an effort like a family, to talk to the cousin, to talk to the uncle, to talk to people because you're family, to get to know them and for them to get to know you? To the teenagers in the church, do you only see the youth group? Or do you see the older people? Do you run past the gray-haired people in the hall because they're taking so long, walking down the hall? Don't do that. Treat them like your grandparents. Watch out for them. Hold the door for them. Be patient with them. To the older people, do you see the young people? It's just a bunch of whippersnappers, Just always talking and moving and running past you in the hallways, Listen, do you appreciate their life, their energy, their enthusiasm for the things of God? Paul says we should see each other as family, as brothers and sisters. And listen, when we do this right as a church, this is one of the most powerful appeals to the gospel imaginable. Because what did Jesus say? By this, all men will know that you are my disciples if you have love one for another. A family love that would transcend just an event or a gathering, but it actually shows up in your day-to-day life. Do you have family love for those around you? Like an actual concern for them. Like an actual heartbeat of compassion. That's a real person in my Sunday school class. That's a real person in my small group. Paul would urge us to see one another as family. That leads us then to his main instruction number 2. He tells us to care for older widows without family. So first of all, he says treat one another as family. That's across the board. And then in verses 3 to 10, he focuses on the older widows without family. Notice verse 3, it says honor widows. In many Bibles, that's the 2-word header for this section, and it's a good one because that's his main point. Honor widows. That word honor, in our culture, that usually means just to respect someone. But in this day and age, as we'll see next week even, that this idea of honor actually was something a little bit more. It often implied care and even implied finances, like actually taking care of them, providing for them. And so he says what? Honor widows, but then he says who are widows indeed. So this honor isn't for all widows, but Paul has some stipulations here. Now, it sounds cliche, and forgive me for this, but Paul's point is a widow in need is a widow indeed. In other words, a widow who is in need because she has nobody else to lean on. She has no one else to turn to. He says that's who is a widow indeed. And you need to make sure that you honor her. Now, what if a widow has family? Well, Paul clarifies, verse 4. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety, that is the children, in regard to their own family, and to make some return to their parents. For this is acceptable in the sight of God. Paul's teaching here, it really challenges us, does it not? Of how we see our blood relatives and those that we're connected to. It's easy sometimes you move out of the house and you sort of move on and, well, my parents are on their own and, everybody else is on their own. But Paul's teaching here is summed up, own family first. You should care for them. People say, the Bible's not practical. This is immensely practical. Do you actually see your parents and grandparents, your aging relatives, with concern and compassion? Your parents and grandparents, chances are they changed your diapers when you were in need and when you were helpless. And Paul says, why would you not be willing to care for them when they're in need? When they need help? In fact, how selfish do you have to be to neglect the people who didn't neglect you, but who actually cared for you, who raised you, who brought you up? He says, no, this is our first responsibility, is to care for those who have family. There's another reason for this, not just it's practical, but he says at the end of verse 4, because this is acceptable in the sight of God. God is watching. He's looking at this. This is one of the marks that God is going to look at our works. Does it show up in how we care for those that we're related to? How do we treat our aging parents? How do we treat those that are in our family? It was God who said, honor your father and mother. We don't obey them as children when we're adults, but that command never goes away, to honor them. It was God who made provisions for parents and grandparents and strangers and widows in Old Testament law. He baked it into the system. Why? Because God cares about how we care for our own family. Now, not every widow has a family to speak of. So Paul then returns to his main point. Look at verse 5. Now, she who is a widow indeed, and how do you know she's a widow indeed? Who has been left alone. That is, she's destitute. She has no children, no grandchildren, no family members, no siblings, no living branches left in her family tree. If that woman can't depend on family, then who is she going to depend on? Paul says she has fixed her hope on God. That is, she has nowhere else to turn. And in faith, she looks to the Lord. And she pleads with the Lord literally for daily bread, asking for him to provide for her. And he says, such a woman, and you notice that because she continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. Maybe because of age and health, she can't give herself to many things, but she can always give herself to prayer. And so she's committed to praying and looking to the Lord. This description reminds me of, some of you remember Anna from Luke chapter 2. Her husband died after, I think it was 7 years, and she spent most of her life in the temple. What? Praying day and night, looking for the consolation of Israel. Right? With expectation that God will provide. God will give us what we need. And the Lord honored that and blessed her in seeing the baby Jesus. So he says these are the widows that if they have that kind of reputation, they should be cared for. But then notice in verse 6, he gives a contrast. But she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. So Paul is, I think, describing here how widows should not spend their time. He speaks of wanton pleasure. In other words, she is living her life sort of carefree, doing whatever she wants to do. I can almost see this woman in our world today. This widow, she goes to play bingo, and she goes out to eat with her friends, and she goes traveling, and she goes shopping, and she goes here, and she goes there, and she goes everywhere, except she doesn't go to church. And from the world standards, man, she is living it up. Right? She is living the good life. Paul says she looks like she's living it up, but she's actually dead. She's spiritually dead. By the way, if you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, this is actually a really important idea to what we believe. It's called the gospel. We sang about it earlier. That we can be physically alive and yet we are spiritually dead apart from Christ. That we are separated from God because of our sin. And that broken, fractured relationship introduced through the sin of Adam and Eve, it is passed down to us and we act on that. And so we can live our lives and do things that are pleasurable, that are enjoyable, like shopping, like eating, like drinking, like traveling. And yet at the end of it all, something's not right. Something's not satisfying. Because why? Because spiritually we're dead. We're not connected to God, but this is the good news of the gospel and the good news of Christmas. That what? That God sent his son to come. Why? He says that they might have life and have life more abundant. My friends, Jesus offers you something better than traveling and bingo and eating out. He offers you eternal life, satisfying life, a transformed life in him. And it's through his death that he gives us his life. if we repent and believe. And the widow who thinks, well, I finally arrived because I can just live for me now, Paul says she's going to find out in the end she's actually dead. So all this widow stuff, it was not just for Timothy to know. Notice verse 7, he says, prescribe these things. Literally preach these things. The church needs to know these things. Why? So that they may be above reproach. The they could refer to the widows, right? Here's how to live or not to live. But the they could also refer to the congregation, that the congregation can do what's right. Right? In other words, this is not just the widow's ministry, the care for them is not just for the pastor or the elders or the deacons. He says we should all be on the alert. We should all keep a finger on the pulse, looking around. Are there any those in our midst who have needs so that we can help them when the occasion arises? And by the way, for what it's worth, I want to brag on you as a congregation in this. We're certainly not perfect, but I've been here 25 years, and I have seen us time after time respond when people have needs. I've been on the receiving end of prayers and encouragement, and so many others have. In fact, just a couple of days ago, my wife logged in. There was a meal train organized for somebody in the church, and she was going to log in to give a meal, and every slot was already full because so many of you had jumped in to help out. That makes me so proud, so pleased, because that's exactly what Paul is saying, that everyone should have a part in this. And for those of you who may say, well, somebody else will do it, this is for all of us. We should all take stock. We should all be looking around. Are there brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers who are in need? Now, some may say, well, look, I've got my own life. I've got my own job. I got my own kids. I don't have time to help my family. Why would we give money to help widows? We got missionaries. We got ministries. Let's translate the Bible. Let's do these kinds of things. What would Paul say to that? Verse 8. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he's denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Wow. That's a heavy verse. Notice the play on words there, those of his household. Paul uses this word, I think he threads the needle carefully because there's two households in view in 1 Timothy, your physical family household and the spiritual church of God household. And I think the application goes in both directions. A man who won't spend his money to help, his own family or the church's money to help those in the family, he says he's denied the faith. He may profess the faith, but he's not living it out. Because the faith is lived out in these real practical terms. Personal faith shows up in practical love. In fact, the King James says he is worse than an infidel. This is why Jesus so harshly condemned, if you remember, Mark chapter 7, the Pharisees. Remember what the Pharisees said? They said, I can't give my money, I can't provide for my aging parents because all of my money is korban. It's dedicated to God. It's going to go to the temple after I die. And it's literally probably like their retirement in their will. I can't spend that money because it's going to go to God. And Jesus says that is a bunch of man-made nonsense. You've put your traditions over the command of God, which is honor your father and mother. So how about you? Do you have family that it's really easy just sort of out of sight, out of mind? Or do you realize that to true faith in Christ, to recognize that is to recognize the burden, the privilege, the responsibility we have to care for those that we're related to? How is Timothy supposed to figure out who to help? Notice verse 9. He says, a widow is to be put on the list only if. So he's going to give some qualifications, like elders and deacons. Now, I think this list refers to those who are receiving ongoing assistance, who were actually, the church was helping provide for them. We would say benevolence, right? So what qualifications they need to meet? Well, notice what he says in verse 9. If she is not less than 60 years old, generally that's the age where remarriage is unlikely and retirement is likely. Having been the wife, look at verse 9, of one man, that's actually a reversal of the elder deacon qualification. Remember the husband of one wife? This is the same phrase in the reverse. A one-woman man, a one-man woman is what it says here. She's been faithful to her husband. And then verse 10, having a reputation for good works. In other words, she has not denied the faith, but she's lived out the faith. And what good works? What reputation should she have? Look at the rest of verse 10. She's brought up her children. She has shown hospitality to strangers. She's washed the saints' feet. She's assisted those in distress. And she's devoted herself to every good work. Paul says if the church sees a widow who brought her children, when she was married, brought her children to Sunday school for decades, and she served faithfully on the greeters committee, or she served with one of the tellers, and she gave herself to pray for the church, and she was faithfully involved in the ministries of the life of the church. Then her husband dies, and her children is gone, and now she's left to her own. If the church sees a woman like that and can't help her, he says, who are you going to help? She's the prime candidate. She's the one that should be supported and cared for in that way. She is elderly and she is godly, and therefore she should be taken care of. By the way, I think these verses here remind us that on a practical level, that having a criteria for benevolence is a wise thing. Jesus said, you will have the poor with you always. Right? Nobody can help everybody. It'd be nice if we could. But there's a sense in which he says here, you need to see to it that you help those that are truly in need. Because there are people who are lazy, greedy, try to play the system. But those who are truly in need and their reputation shows it, he says you should care for them. Here's a church, we have a benevolence form. When someone comes, if it's not a crisis need, we ask them to fill it out. And on the top it says, quote, the widowed, orphaned, and disabled are given priority for assistance. Why? Because God cares about how we care for those who can't care for themselves. Paul says we should care for them. The early church began to do this. Acts chapter 6, right? The first soup kitchen. The church was helping feed the widows, literally their daily bread, and to give it to them, and it created this tension. Why did they do that? Because Psalm 68:5, God is a defender of the widow. In Malachi, God says those who neglect the widow, the orphan, or the stranger, he says, my wrath will be poured out against them. So this is no small thing in the eyes of God. Just go read the book of the book of Luke. How often does Jesus interact with widows? Right? He raised the widow's son that had died. He complimented the widow who gave the 2 pennies of her sacrificial gift. And even while he was hanging on the cross with his dying breath, he provided for his widowed mother to have someone to take care of her. That is the heart of our God, a big heart towards those who are in need. Do you have that heart? Do you have that sense of compassion, or even just that awareness? Is that even on your radar screen? It's very easy, out of sight, out of mind. Well, that's somebody else's deal. Paul says, no. In the church, if we're the household, we should be alert and looking and seeking to help where we can. What do we do with this? Well, this is one small way that you do this. In fact, every week when you give your offering, you're helping do this regularly. Part of our budget line, if you ever look at it closely, is a thing called Mission Dignity. It is actually a nationwide benevolence fund for widows of SBC pastors. Many smaller churches can't provide for their pastor's retirement, and so their spouse will die, and then the widow has to pick between food and medicine. And this fund is set up to help them. And through your offerings, we give to that each month to help make sure that others can have. It's also why we have a deacon of widows and shut-ins. In fact, many of you know he just became an elder, so we're going to need a new deacon of widows and shut-ins. So if anybody's interested, please talk to us. And while most of our 19 widows, they have family and have means, the church should be proactive and looking for what are tangible ways, what are things that we can do to help one another. And if you are one of the widows or a needy person in our church, please let us know what your needs are. Serving you is not a burden. It is a privilege for us to be able to obey Jesus. It is an honor for us to be able to do that. So please let us know. Notice one last little application here that I think is important. Notice Paul says that the church steps in when there's no family to step up. But he's also clear where there's family to step up, then that family should step up. So how are you doing in that area? Like think about your family. In fact, some of you are thinking, well, I just saw them at Thanksgiving, so I'm done. No. This is not a one-time thing. You check the list, okay, I saw my family. It's an ongoing care. It is a concern for those that maybe have nobody else to be concerned for them. An aunt, a cousin, a parent or grandparent. Are you actively seeking to care for them? Brothers and sisters, if Christianity doesn't work at home, it doesn't work. And he says here that we should, the people that are closest to us should see the gospel on full display. Paul is saying, don't let your atheist sister show you up. Make sure the gospel is on display in your love and your care and your compassion. Don't be worse than an unbeliever. And by the way, I have seen so many members of our church do this with excellence and who are doing this. I won't embarrass anyone, but listen to me. Those of you caring for aging parents, you are doing the Lord's work. Keep it up. I'm sure it's difficult and I'm sure it's not easy, but God sees, God knows, and God will reward you for your faithfulness. I promise you that. So Paul says to care for older widows who have no family. Number 3, final instruction here, verses 11 to 16. He tells us to urge younger widows to have family, to treat one another as family, care for older widows without family, and then number 3, urge younger widows to have family. Just as sure as some people should be on the list, the benevolence care, there are some that should not, verse 11, but refuse to put younger widows on the list. Notice that reference to younger widows. This was much more common in that day probably than it is today. First of all, there was often a huge gap in age between husbands and wives in many situations. It was not uncommon to have a husband be in his 50s and the wife be in her teens or early 20s. And so just math tells you that somebody's going to die sooner, and right, that becomes a common thing. But also thanks to war and disease and famine, people just often died younger. One scholar estimates that as much as 30% of the Roman Empire's population was just widows. And most of them were in this younger category because of these other circumstances. So this was a huge issue. And Paul says that these younger widows should not go on the list. Now, again, I think the list means like ongoing care. I don't think it's prohibiting individual care as needs arise, but in terms of this ongoing honoring. Why? Well, look what he says in verse 11. For when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ, they want to get married, thus incurring condemnation because they have set aside their previous pledge. Now, what does that mean? Well, we have run out of time. No, I'm just kidding. This verse is like a speed bump, okay? If you hit it really fast, you might do some damage. So you got to kind of slow down and make your way over this verse here, okay? When he speaks of these younger widows, it seems that this list of widows who were cared for financially by the church, it seems like one of the commitments to that was to remain single. Because as I said earlier, it was assumed that your safety net was your family, right? So if you're married, you had children, grandchildren, they would actually take care of you. But it seems that if you were a widow indeed, and you had no other, that you had to remain single for the church to continue to provide and to help you. And so he says here, these younger widows, they should not go on the list. Because why? Because they may, when they feel sensual desires in disregards of Christ, they want to get married. Now, I don't think he's discouraging remarriage, because he's going to talk about that, actually command it in a few verses. I think what Paul is saying here is that they may be too eager, right? If they take this pledge, I'm going to be on the list and never get remarried, they may be eager to want to get remarried, but to do so prematurely. And the language there, he says, in disregard of Christ, and then he says in verse 12, they've set aside their previous pledge, or it's literally, they've set aside their previous faith. I think what he's pointing out is that some of these younger widows, they might be tempted to just marry the most eligible bachelor who might be a pagan. And it was assumed in that day, if you married a man, that his religion became your religion. And they would be tempted to leave the faith just to be taken care of, just for the money, or just for the desire for intimacy and marriage and family and all those natural things. And so he pumps the brakes and says, don't encourage that. That's why 1 Corinthians 7 says that for a believer, marriage should be only in the Lord. right? That Christians should only marry other Christians. And this woman might be tempted to ignore that just to be taken care of, and would actually abandon, walk away from Christ in this. So they may be tempted to do that. And then he says they may also be immature. Verse 13. At the same time, they also learn to be idle as they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. So again, these widows on the list were kind of being paid by the church or cared for, and it seems they ministered to the whole church. And I think the house to house refers to what we would call Sunday school to Sunday school, or small group to small group, right? They were assisting the church, because we noticed earlier they washed the feet of the saints. They assisted those in distress. It's kind of like they were serving for the church. And he says what? That the older widows do that, but the younger widows, if they are immature, what he says, they will be tempted to be gossips and busybodies. That if they don't have the maturity yet, the life experience yet, they may instead actually work against the church. I think the Apostle Paul is mentioning here that they may have too much time and too much energy on their hands and become frivolous and gossipy. One commentator wrote this phrase, that they would receive, quote, subsidized leisure to become a nuisance. Or as another commentator put it, premature retirement can be a gateway to bad habits. Or to put it more bluntly, what's the old phrase? Idleness is the devil's workshop. Right? That they have too much time, too much energy, they're young, they're healthy, and so what? They may get themselves into trouble, and they need instead, Paul says, to do what God has designed them to do. And so he says in verse 14, therefore I want younger widows to get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no occasion for reproach, for some have already turned aside to follow Satan. Again, I don't think he means getting remarried is the issue. It's leaving Christ. It's going for the first man that would actually maybe lead them astray from the faith. Now you say, wait a minute, what about singleness? Didn't Paul talk about 1 Corinthians 7, singleness? Yes, I don't think these are in contradiction. I think the key to understanding this is what he said back in verse 11. He says, refuse to put younger widows on the list, for when they feel sensual desires. The women in 1 Corinthians 7, or men, the single people, they've received singleness. He talks about singleness and celibacy as if it is a gift. And they've now leveraged that for the good of the kingdom. So they're wholly devoted to the Lord. They're not divided in their allegiance to a wife and a family and to the Lord, but they can give themselves totally to the Lord. They can leverage their time, leverage their energy, leverage their opportunities, and do more for the church and more for God's people. And they have received, it seems, this celibacy and singleness as a gift from God. But these younger widows, if you notice, they're not content with singleness or celibacy. Because he says they still feel sensual desires. That's not a bad thing. God made us, we already talked about that, with sexual desires. But rather than put them in a position to tempt them to break their commitment to the church, where they would have to remain single in order to be on the list, Paul says they should be encouraged instead to get married and to have a family and to fulfill the role that God has created women and mothers for. It's a great reminder, I think, there in verse 14, that motherhood is not a lesser role. He elevates this. In fact, some of you young moms, do you ever feel like raising children is not just tiresome, but it's like a daily battle? You know why? Because it is. It is a spiritual battle. And the devil does not want you to fulfill that role. He does not want you to care for those children. He does not want you to raise them in the things of Christ. He said wants you to have an occasion to give the enemy an occasion for reproach and to turn aside and to not do this role well. In fact, I was thinking about it. What do mothers of small children do? Right? They really do the things that the older widows on the list have set a good example for. Go back to verse 10. Right? Good works. She's brought up her children, right? So a younger mother who has children, right? She can bring them up. And then it says she has shown hospitality to strangers. How many young mothers have play dates with kids in the neighborhood? and they get to know other moms, and they have gospel opportunities, and they've made a point to build these relationships and be a good example in that. Then he says that she has washed the saints' feet, right? Well, what does a mother do? Well, she washes her children's feet and their bottoms and their armpits and all other things, right? That's what she does. It's in service to her family. And she has assisted those in distress. Children are constantly in distress. They're always hungry or crying, right? Or want to be changed or whatever it might be, right? In other words, she's fulfilling this role in her own family. You see, I think Paul is reminding us here that motherhood, it means service. It means sacrifice. It means sharing. It means giving. Motherhood exhibits Christ-likeness, to care for those who are so needy and who frankly can do nothing for you. In fact, maybe we could flip that around. You can tell the character of a woman by how she treats those, her own children, who can do nothing for her. Paul says, have a family. Encourage them to this. Verse 16, if any woman who is a believer, and this is likely a younger widow, has dependent widows, so her own mother or mother-in-law or others in her family, and they are connected to her, she must assist them, and the church must not be burdened. Why? So that it may assist those who are widows indeed. So do you see how he brings it together? That we care for the whole church by caring for our immediate family. We actually provide for one another in our own families. And again, in this day and age, families were a lot more connected and lived around each other. But how much more then should we care for those that God has brought into our family? I said at the beginning, you can tell the character of a church by how it treats those who can do nothing for them. Is there not in that an echo of the gospel? Because isn't it true that you can tell a lot about the character of God by how he cared for those of us who could do nothing for him? See, this is an opportunity to put the gospel on display. Week after week, day after day. He says, some of my family's difficult, some of my family's ugly, some of my family's mean. Is that not right grounds for grace and mercy and forgiveness? And to do to them as the Lord has so graciously done for you? My friends, it is an opportunity. It's a privilege. Not just to preach the gospel, yes, but to actually put it into practice. To not deny the faith, but to embody the faith by providing for our family and for the household of God.